England is 50,000 square miles with 56 million people. You would think there is no room left for anything to disappear. But there are villages in this country where the school desks still have names carved into them from the last day of class, and no one lives there. Villages where the only sound is tank fire, villages where the ground occasionally gives up a skeleton that someone burned and dismembered 700 years ago, because people were afraid it might get up and walk. We are counting down 17 of the weirdest, most unsettling villages in England. Do not skip to the end. Hit that subscribe button because we have more forgotten history coming. Stick around until the end because number 1 is a village where someone left a letter pinned to a church door in 1943, asking soldiers to please be careful with the buildings, and the government never let a single one of those people come home. Dunwich sits on the Suffolk coast about 90 miles northeast of London, a village of around 200 people now, with just the one pub and the one church. The number of churches it used to have was 8. In the 11th and 12th centuries, Dunwich stood as one of the largest ports in medieval England, a city that rivaled London in size and importance. It served as the capital of the Kingdom of East Anglia. Its own bishop, its own mint, 2 monasteries, 3 chapels, a hospital, a guildhall. Ships from across Europe docked in its harbour. And then the sea started taking it back. Storms hit between 1286 and 1347, each one wiping out more of the town. The harbour silted up, the coastline retreated, and by the 1500s, over half of Dunwich was underwater. Today, the ruins of the old city sit on the seabed just offshore. In 2008, marine archaeologists mapped them with sonar and found what is left of at least 3 drowned churches. Locals say that during bad storms, you can still hear the bells ringing beneath the waves. It rivaled London. Now it is a pub and a church, a bell no one can reach. Winspit is not a village in the traditional sense. Think of it as an abandoned quarry cut directly into the cliffs of the Jurassic coast near Worth Matravus on the Isle of Purbeck. The Purbeck limestone pulled from here was shipped to London for the kinds of buildings you see on postcards. Quarrymen carved vast caverns and underground galleries into the cliff face, and they lived in stone cottages a short walk from the edge. The whole operation ran until about 1940, and then it stopped cold. What is left behind is deeply unsettling. The cavernous openings stare out at the sea like empty eye sockets, and the waves crash into the cliff base directly below. Doctor Who filmed here, Star Wars Andor filmed here. Filmmakers picked up on something in this place that does not feel quite English, something too raw and too exposed. The cottages are ruined and empty now. On a grey afternoon with the wind coming hard off the channel, Winspit feels like somewhere humans tried to make a mark, and the coast just shrugged it off. At the end of a dead-end lane in the Cherwell Valley near Kidlington, you will find a ruined Elizabethan manor house with no roof and empty windows framing nothing but sky. This was Hampton Gay. The manor went up in the late 1500s, a grand stone house for a family of means. The village around it never got large, but it functioned for centuries. It had a paper mill on the River Cherwell and a parish church that still stands alone in a field nearby. A fire gutted the manor house in 1887. The owner, a colonel whose finances were falling apart, could not afford to rebuild, so the stone shell was left to the weather. The population bled away quietly after that. By 1931, the parish counted 28 people, and the civil parish was abolished the following year. Nobody made a dramatic exit. Nobody fought. The place just stopped. The church remains, and sheep now graze where people once lived. Most people in Oxfordshire have never heard of Hampton Gay, and in its own way, that is exactly the point. West Tofts sits inside the Stanford training area near Thetford in Norfolk, which happens to be one of the military's largest live fire ranges. The Ministry of Defence took it in 1942, just like several other villages on this list, and never gave it back. What sets West Tofts apart is how little access anyone gets. Imber in Wiltshire opens to the public on select days, and Tyneham in Dorset is open most weekends. West Tofts is almost never open. A handful of guided tours get approved each year, and even those can be cancelled without warning if the army is conducting exercises nearby. The village church, St Mary's, is the most striking thing about the place. Built in the 14th century and expanded in the 19th century, it is a massive structure that feels entirely too big for the small estate village it once served. A fire badly damaged it in 2023. Now it stands inside a restricted zone surrounded by tank tracks and spent shell casings. You cannot drive to West Tofts. You cannot walk to West Tofts. For most of the year, the only people who see it are soldiers training for war. In a remote valley in the Yorkshire Wolds sits the most intensively studied, deserted village in Britain. Wharram Percy was occupied for 600 years, from the 9th century right through to the early 1500s, and at its peak it had 2 manor houses, a church, a mill, and around 35 peasant homes. The village did not die in a single disaster. Sheep farming replaced crops, the Black Death thinned the population, and changing economics made the whole settlement unworkable. The last houses were demolished around the year 1500, yet the church kept holding services until the 1940s, decades after everyone else had gone. English Heritage maintains the site today, and the foundations of more than 30 medieval houses are still visible as grass-covered earthworks. But the real darkness at Wharram Percy only surfaced during the excavations that ran from 1950 to 1990, the longest dig in British archaeology. The archaeologists found human remains from the 11th through the 14th centuries that someone had decapitated, dismembered, and burned after death. The working theory is that medieval villagers believed corpses could rise from the grave, so they made sure the dead stayed dead. 6 centuries of dismantling the departed to make sure they could not come back. Between Staithes and Runswick Bay on the North Yorkshire coast, Port Mulgrave is somewhere the scale of things doesn't add up. The industrialist Sir Charles Palmer built it in the 1850s as a purpose-built harbour, so he could ship ironstone from his nearby mines straight to the blast furnaces of Jarrow. A tunnel was cut directly through the cliff from the mine to the harbour, and trains hauled ironstone through the darkness to waiting ships on the other side. Mining stopped in the 1920s, the pier was dismantled in 1934. Today the harbour wall has partly fallen into the sea, and the tunnel entrance is still visible in the cliff face but sealed shut, with the mine shaft above capped in concrete. Down at the shore, improvised fishing huts cling to the base of the cliffs, cobbled together from driftwood and corrugated iron and whatever else the tide delivered. Rows of miners' cottages still stand at the top, and the mine owner's house is still there too, looking down on what is left of his empire. Massive industrial machinery reduced to rusted tracks, a caved-in hole in the cliff, and the quiet sound of waves. Ravenser no longer exists in any physical form. You cannot visit it or photograph it or walk through its ruins, because the entire town is submerged under the North Sea. Founded around 1235 on Spurn Point, at the mouth of the Humber estuary, it grew into a major East Coast port with a weekly market, an annual fair, and its own Member of Parliament. Then the sea came for it. Storms in the 1340s and the 1350s chewed away at the shoreline, and a great storm in 1362 overwhelmed what was left of the defences. The town was abandoned, then fully submerged, and the coastline kept retreating until the exact location sat somewhere offshore under the waves. This was not a quiet hamlet, this was a parliamentary borough with trade links across Europe. And it was erased. No ruins, no plaques, no viewing platform, just water. If you're enjoying stories like these, hit that thumbs up and drop a comment about which of these villages you would actually visit. We would love to know who is brave enough and who is not. On the tin coast of West Cornwall, the Crown's engine houses of Botallack cling to the cliffs above the Atlantic like a nightmare about the Industrial Revolution. Botallack was among the most significant mining complexes in Cornwall, part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The shafts plunge hundreds of feet underground, and the tunnels ran half a mile out under the seabed, which meant the miners could hear the ocean grinding against the rocks above their heads while they worked. Copper and tin extraction from this landscape went back to the Bronze Age, but the industry peaked in the 18th and 19th centuries and collapsed when prices crashed in the late 1800s. Miners emigrated to the Americas, Australia, and South Africa, scattering Cornish surnames across the globe as they went. Today, the engine houses are roofless, their chimneys still pointing at the sky, and the whole site is free to visit under the care of the National Trust. The scale is wrong. Massive industrial ruins on an empty, wild coastline, the Atlantic smashing into the cliffs below, and nothing else as far as you can see. Imber sits in the centre of Salisbury Plain. It was evacuated in December 1943, the same month as Tyneham in Dorset, for exactly the same reason. The army needed space to train for the invasion of Europe, and 150 people were given weeks to leave. The difference is what happened afterwards. Tyneham eventually opened to the public and its story got told. Imber was completely walled off for decades, and even today you can only visit on a handful of specified days each year. St. Giles Church still stands, remarkably intact, and a bus brings visitors through the military checkpoints on open days. The rest of the village tells a harder story. Many houses were reduced to shells for urban warfare training. The manor house was demolished in the 1950s, the school is gone. What remains looks more like a training ground than somewhere people raise children. Former residents and their descendants have campaigned for the return of Imber for over 80 years. The army still says no. Salisbury Plain is too useful for tank exercises and live fire drills, and the 150 people who once called this place home are still waiting for a knock on the door that is never going to come. In the Mardale Valley in what is now the Lake District, there was once a remote farming hamlet with a pub called the Dunwich, a small stone church and farmhouses that had stood for centuries. In the 1930s, when Manchester needed more water, the Manchester Corporation dammed Haweswater and raised the water level by 29 metres. Mardale Green was deliberately drowned. The villagers were compensated and relocated, and the bodies from the churchyard were moved to a cemetery in nearby Shap. The valley that people once described as one of the most beautiful in the Lake District became the bottom of a reservoir, but the village refuses to stay hidden. When drought hits hard enough, the ruins re-emerge. Stone walls and bridge arches broke the surface in 2022. In 2025, the driest spring in over a century exposed the village extensively. Foundations of the Dunwich pub, field boundaries and the outlines of streets that people had walked for generations before Manchester drowned them came back into view. Then the rains returned, the valley filled up and Mardale Green went back to sleep. Derwent was a close-knit village in the upper Derwent Valley of the Peak District, with stone cottages, a church, a school, and a manor house. Along with the neighbouring hamlet of Ashopton, it was sacrificed to create Lady Bower Reservoir, which opened in 1945 to supply water to Sheffield, Derby, Nottingham, and Leicester. The flooding was methodical. Bodies were exhumed from the churchyard and reburied elsewhere. The buildings were stripped of anything useful. The church spire was left standing, poking above the waterline, until the authorities decided after 2 years that it was a safety hazard, and they demolished it with explosives in 1947. In dry spells, the reservoir drops enough to reveal what is underneath. The old packhorse bridge comes up first, then the foundations, and then the faint outlines of streets. The drought of 2018 brought the ruins to the surface for the first time in 23 years, and people walked across what used to be someone's living room floor. Hallsands was a fishing village on the South Devon coast, home to 160 people in 37 houses, and it was protected from the sea by a shingle beach that had been there for thousands of years. In the 1890s, the Admiralty authorised the dredging of 660,000 tonnes of shingle from the seabed right off Hallsands. They needed it for the growing Devonport dockyard in Plymouth. The beach was stripped and the village lost the only thing standing between it and the ocean. On the night of the 26th of January 1917, a powerful storm combined with high tides and the village gave way. Houses broke apart and tumbled into the water. Only one building survived in habitable condition, the highest house in the village, the Pretjohn family home. Elizabeth Pretjohn refused to leave after it happened. She lived there alone for another 47 years, surviving on eggs from her chickens and whatever fish she could catch until her death in 1964. The ruined foundations are still visible on the shoreline, and a viewing platform overlooks the site. One woman outlasted the government's negligence by nearly half a century, living in the only house the sea did not manage to take. Pluckley looks like a postcard of rural Kent. Timber-framed houses, a parish church, and about 1,000 residents getting on with their lives in a village that could have been designed for a guidebook. The 1989 Guinness Book of Records named it the most haunted village in Britain. The category no longer exists, but the reputation has never faded, because Pluckley reportedly hosts at least 12 different ghosts, with some accounts pushing the number closer to 15. The highwayman was pinned to a tree at a crossroads called Fright Corner. The Red Lady wanders the churchyard. The Screaming Man, a brickworks worker who fell to his death, still cries out near the old clay pits. The schoolmaster hanged himself, and children claim to have seen him in the schoolhouse window. The watercress woman set herself on fire, and her ghost is said to wander the bridge near the stream. A phantom coach, a monk, a gypsy woman, and a miller round out the list. What makes Pluckley strange is the disconnect. It does not look haunted, it looks like somewhere you would take your grandmother for tea. That is what makes stepping into it feel like stepping into a photograph with something standing just outside the frame. Eyam in the Peak District is often called the Plague Village, but that phrase does not capture what happened here. In August 1665, a bundle of flea-infested cloth arrived from London, which was then in the grip of the Great Plague, and within weeks the plague had reached Eyam. The rector, William Mompesson, and the former rector, Thomas Stanley, persuaded the villagers to quarantine the entire village. Eyam cut itself off from the outside world to stop the plague from spreading further. Food was left at a boundary stone on the village edge. Church services moved outdoors to a natural dell because gathering inside would have accelerated the infection. Over 14 months, 260 villagers died from a population estimated between 350 and 800. Entire families were wiped out. Mompesson buried his own wife Catherine in August 1666. The Hancock family buried 7 members in 8 days, and their graves at the Riley site are still there, marked and maintained. The village committed a kind of mass suicide to save strangers. You can walk through Eyam today, past the plague cottages with their memorial plaques, past the boundary stone, and the place carries the weight of a decision that most of us cannot imagine making. On a hilltop near the Bedfordshire village of Clophill, the ruins of Old St Mary's Church stand abandoned since the 1840s, when a new church was built in the village centre. For over a century, the old church decayed quietly, a ruin nobody paid much attention to. Then in 1963, the graves were desecrated. Human remains were dug up and arranged in patterns across the church floor. 6 years later, in 1969, it happened again, and this time the desecration was worse. The national press fed a full moral panic about satanic cults, and by the 1970s, the church roof had been stripped deliberately to discourage further gatherings. The site still draws ghost hunters and people of genuinely dark intention. The tomb of a local family has been chained down with a heavy stone slab, and even that does not stop everyone who makes the climb after dark. Strange lights and cold spots are reported regularly. This is not a place with a ghost story. This is a place where real people did real things to the dead, and something about the location keeps drawing people back to do it again. Kielder is not abandoned. Roughly 194 people live here, and it is the most remote village in England. The nearest cash machine is 18 miles away in Bellingham. The nearest shopping centre, Hexham, is about 30 miles. Kielder sits at the head of Kielder Water, a reservoir wrapped in Kielder Forest, the largest man-made woodland in England. 158 million planted trees cover an area that feels more like Finland or Canada than anything an hour from Newcastle. The darkness here is extreme. Kielder is a dark sky park, and at night with no moon, the blackness is almost total. The silence hits just as hard. You can stand at the edge of the forest and hear nothing except the occasional creak of water against the reservoir bank. The forest went in during the 20th century, an artificial wilderness built on farmland and, according to local folklore, the site of settlements flooded when the reservoir was created. Whether actual villages were drowned is disputed in the records, but the feeling of the place is not up for debate. Kielder does not belong in England, and standing in the middle of it long enough, neither will you. Tyneham sits in a valley that slopes down to Wharram Bay on the Jurassic coast, in a corner of Dorset that looks, from a distance, like any number of quiet English coastal villages. Get closer and you notice that every house is a roofless shell, and the only buildings with intact roofs are the church and the schoolhouse, kept that way by the Ministry of Defence. In November 1943, the War Office requisitioned 7,500 acres around Tyneham for tank training ahead of D-Day. The 225 residents were given 28 days' notice to leave their homes. Before they walked out, somebody pinned a note to the door of St. Mary's Church. The note read, "Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes where many of us lived for generations to help win the war, to keep men free. We shall return one day and thank you for treating the village kindly." The war ended. In 1948, the government issued a compulsory purchase order. The villagers never returned. The church has been restored and still holds services occasionally. The schoolhouse was turned into a museum, and inside it you can see the work children left on their desks the last day they came to class. Handwriting exercises, sums in pencil, names written in the margin. The post office still has its original counter, and the telephone box still stands, and none of it has been used by the people it was built for since 1943. Every few years, a former resident or one of their children comes back to Tyneham and walks through the valley that their family was told they could return to after the war. The landscape stayed, everything else left.